In 1943, a man named Elder Clarence E. Church stood in a small storefront on Vermont Avenue in Los Angeles and started a church with a handful of people. He had no idea that 8 decades later, that congregation would grow into one of the most powerful religious institutions in America, a place that would count entertainers, politicians, and a sitting president's faith advisory council among its orbit. He had no idea that the church he planted would one day control more real estate in the Crenshaw corridor than almost anyone else in South Los Angeles. And he definitely had no idea that when the time came to hand off leadership decades later, the entire religious world would be watching to see if it survived the transition. This is the story of West Angeles Church of God in Christ, and it is one of the most fascinating case studies in American religious succession happening right now, in real time. Let's start with the man most people associate with this church, because for most of its existence, West Angeles was not really known as Elder Church's church. It was known as Bishop Blake's church. When Elder Church died in 1968, leadership passed to a young pastor named Charles Edward Blake, Sr. He inherited a congregation of somewhere between 40 and 50 people. That's it, 40 or 50. Think about that for a second, because what happened next is almost hard to believe. Under Blake's leadership, that tiny congregation exploded. By the time he stepped away from the pulpit more than 5 decades later, membership had grown to over 24,000 people, with some reports putting the number even higher, above 25,000. That's not growth. That's an entire small city choosing to gather under one roof, week after week, for 53 years straight. The physical footprint of the church tells the same story. In 1981, the congregation moved into a new home on Crenshaw Boulevard with a 1,000-seat auditorium, which at the time felt massive. It wasn't massive enough. By 1999, the church dedicated a new cathedral at 3600 Crenshaw Boulevard with 5,000 seats, and even that building would eventually need to expand. In 2019, the church sold its older property at 3045 Crenshaw to help fund construction of a brand new family life center, a 4-story facility that finally opened its doors in October of 2024. So even as leadership was changing hands, the physical infrastructure of this institution kept growing. That matters, because it tells you this was never a church built around the charisma of one man standing at a podium. It was being built, brick by brick, as an institution designed to outlast its founder. And that becomes the central question of this video. Bishop Charles Blake built something enormous. But when the man who built it finally steps back, does the empire crumble or does it hold? Because history is full of examples of massive religious organizations that were essentially one person's personality, and when that person left, the whole thing fractured. Congregants scattered, money dried up, infighting broke out over who deserved the crown. So the real question isn't whether Bishop Blake was successful. Obviously, he was. The real question is whether West Angeles built the kind of institutional bones that can survive a changing of the guard. And based on the evidence, the answer looks like a cautious but confident yes. Before we get into the succession itself, it's worth understanding just how much influence Bishop Blake accumulated outside the 4 walls of his own church, because this wasn't just a local pastor with a big congregation. Blake also rose to become the presiding bishop of the entire Church of God in Christ denomination, which is one of the largest Pentecostal denominations in the United States, overseeing millions of members across thousands of congregations nationwide. He served on President Obama's White House Advisory Council on Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, putting him in direct contact with the highest levels of American government. He founded an organization called Save Africa's Children, which partnered with faith-based groups across nearly 24 sub-Saharan African countries to support children affected by the HIV and AIDS crisis. This is a man whose reach extended from a pulpit in South Los Angeles all the way to the West Wing and across an ocean to villages in Africa. That kind of national and international profile matters when you're thinking about succession, because it means the person taking over isn't just inheriting a church. They're inheriting a legacy with global reach and a reputation that took decades to build. Now, here's something a lot of people get confused about, and it's actually really important to untangle. Bishop Blake stepped away from two very different leadership roles, and they didn't happen at the same time. First, he retired as presiding bishop of the entire Church of God in Christ denomination back on March 19th of 2021, and Bishop J. Drew Sherd Sr. was installed as his successor the very next day. That was a denomination-wide transition, affecting the whole national organization, not just West Angeles. Then, separately, just over a year later, in April of 2022, Bishop Blake made a deeply personal announcement to his own local congregation. Standing before the members of West Angeles on a Sunday morning, he revealed that he had been living with Parkinson's disease for roughly 10 years, and that the time had come for him to step back as senior pastor of the church he had led for over 5 decades. He announced that his sons, Charles Blake II and Lawrence Blake, would begin taking on greater responsibility, serving in a de facto leadership capacity while the formal transition took shape. Think about the courage that takes. This is a man in his 80s, publicly disclosing a serious health diagnosis to a congregation of tens of thousands of people, many of whom had only ever known him as their spiritual father. And, instead of clinging to the position, he used that moment to set the transition in motion himself, on his own terms, rather than leaving it to chance or forcing his family and church to figure it out after he was gone. That distinction, choosing to hand off power deliberately rather than being forced out by circumstance, is one of the biggest reasons analysts of religious institutions point to West Angeles as a relatively healthy succession story. The formal announcement came a few months later on September 18th of 2022. Bishop Blake stood before his congregation and said, in his own words, that it had been the deepest honor and greatest joy of his life to serve as senior pastor for 53 years, and that after a journey filled with blessings and miracles too numerous to count, he and his wife, First Lady May Blake, had made the decision to retire from active pastoral ministry. And then, on October 23rd of 2022, the church held a full installation service, officially naming Elder Charles Blake II and his wife, Lady Deandra Blake, as the new senior pastor and First Lady of West Angeles. So, who exactly is this next-generation leader stepping into arguably one of the toughest jobs in American ministry? Charles Blake II isn't some outsider parachuting in with no track record. He grew up in this church. He was raised watching his father build this institution from the ground up, before ever becoming senior pastor. He spent roughly 13 years serving as the church's director of community relations and as an assistant pastor, meaning he had over a decade of hands-on experience inside the actual operations of the church before he was ever handed the keys. In November of 2021, nearly a year before the full transition, he was elevated to co-pastor, which gave the congregation time to adjust to seeing him in a leadership role alongside his father, rather than experiencing a sudden and jarring switch. On the education side, he's a graduate of Oral Roberts University, and he earned his Master of Divinity from the Interdenominational Theological Center, which happens to be the exact same seminary his father graduated from decades earlier. He also completed training at the Harvard Leadership Institute and the Institute of Church Administration and Management. In other words, this wasn't a spontaneous promotion. This was a decade-plus long groundwork of education, mentorship, and gradually increasing responsibility, all leading toward this exact moment. And to his credit, Blake II has been remarkably honest about the pressure that comes with following a legend. He's publicly acknowledged that some members of the congregation have doubts about whether he can live up to his father's legacy, and instead of dismissing that concern, he's addressed it head-on with humility, essentially telling people that he's not trying to replace his father. He's trying to build on the foundation his father laid while bringing his own voice to the pulpit. That kind of transparency tends to earn trust rather than lose it, especially in a congregation that has been fiercely loyal to the Blake family for half a century. Now let's talk about why West Angeles is structurally different from a lot of churches that collapse after a founding pastor leaves. Because this is really the heart of the story. A huge number of megachurches, especially ones built around one dominant charismatic preacher, are essentially fragile the moment that preacher exits the stage. The congregation shrinks, donations drop, staff leave. Sometimes lawsuits break out between family members fighting over control of the assets. West Angeles avoided a lot of that risk because Bishop Blake didn't just build a following, he built an actual organization with real infrastructure that exists independently of who's standing at the pulpit on Sunday morning. Consider the West Angeles Community Development Corporation, which was founded back in 1994 in partnership with Dr. Lula Bolton and the church's trustees as an outreach arm designed to fight poverty and expand economic opportunity in South Los Angeles. This wasn't some small side project. Over the following decades, the West Angeles CDC became the largest landowner in the Crenshaw corridor. Think about that. A church-affiliated nonprofit became the single biggest property owner in one of the most historically significant Black neighborhoods in Los Angeles. Through that CDC, the church helped develop over 400 new units of affordable housing, secured financing for a 45,000-square-foot commercial complex, and helped train young people in mediation and dispute resolution. It helped incubate and launch dozens of minority-owned businesses. And by its own accounting, the organization has helped more than 4,000 low to moderate income households become first-time homeowners. In 1993, West Angeles became the first church in South Los Angeles to partner with Habitat for Humanity to build homes for families in need. This matters enormously for the succession story because it means West Angeles isn't just a spiritual community, it's an economic institution with deep roots in the physical neighborhood around it. People aren't just showing up because of a charismatic sermon. Families are living in homes that this organization helped them buy. Entrepreneurs are running businesses that this organization helped launch. That kind of community infrastructure doesn't disappear just because leadership changes hands. It creates a form of institutional gravity that keeps people connected to the church regardless of who's preaching on a given Sunday. There's also the sheer administrative machinery Bishop Blake spent decades building behind the scenes. Running a congregation of over 24,000 members isn't like running a small neighborhood church where the pastor personally handles everything. It requires serious financial systems, membership databases, a trained staff, an organized board of trustees, and clear lines of authority. According to reporting on the church's operations, Bishop Blake spent years developing exactly that kind of administrative backbone. essentially professionalizing the church's operations so that it could function like a well-run institution rather than depending entirely on his personal presence. When a religious organization reaches that level of operational maturity, leadership transitions become far less catastrophic because the systems keep running even while the person at the top changes. It's also worth mentioning that Bishop Blake didn't simply vanish after retirement. He holds the title of Presiding Bishop Emeritus, and he has continued to make occasional appearances at the pulpit for special messages and significant church events. For a congregation that spent 5 decades under his direct leadership, having him remain present, even in a reduced ceremonial capacity, provides an enormous sense of continuity and emotional stability. Long-time members don't feel like they lost their spiritual father overnight. They feel like they're watching him gradually pass the torch while still being able to see him, hear him, and receive his blessing on major occasions. That's a very different emotional experience than an abrupt departure, and it significantly reduces the shock that often triggers membership decline after a founding pastor leaves. So, has the plan actually worked in practice? Early signs suggest yes. Reports and first-hand accounts from the installation weekend in October of 2022 describe the sanctuary continuing to fill up, with major public figures and fellow clergy showing up to honor both the outgoing and incoming pastors. During the celebration, other prominent voices in the community publicly pledged their support to the new pastor, essentially telling the congregation, in effect, that following Charles Blake II was the natural continuation of following his father. That kind of public endorsement from respected figures within the community carries real weight in a religious institution where trust and reputation move through relationships and word of mouth. And the church has kept moving forward with major projects since the transition, including completing that new 4-story Family Life Center in October of 2024, which now houses expanded programs for youth development, homework assistance and educational enrichment, family counseling that addresses both spiritual and mental health needs, and nutrition and crisis intervention services for families facing basic needs. None of that sounds like an institution that's contracting or losing momentum. It sounds like one that's still actively expanding its mission under new leadership. Now, to be fair, no succession like this is completely without risk. Following someone who built an institution from 50 members to over 24,000 is an enormous psychological and practical challenge, no matter how well prepared you are. There will always be a segment of longtime congregants who simply can't separate the church from Bishop Blake himself. And some of those individuals may eventually drift toward other congregations over time, especially as the makeup of the surrounding neighborhood continues to change. Younger generations also engage with religious institutions differently than their parents and grandparents did, often preferring more digital, decentralized, or non-denominational approaches to faith, which creates pressure on every legacy megachurch, not just this one, to keep evolving. Charles Blake II will have to prove himself over years, not months, and the true test of any succession like this usually isn't the installation weekend, it's whether the institution is still thriving 5 or 10 years down the road. But based on everything we've laid out here, the fundamentals are about as strong as you could hope for. A deliberate, multi-year transition plan instead of a sudden vacancy. A successor with over a decade of hands-on experience inside the organization before taking the top job. Formal education and leadership training specifically preparing him for this exact role. A retiring leader who remains present as an emeritus figure rather than disappearing entirely. And most importantly, a massive, independent economic and community infrastructure through the CDC, affordable housing developments, and dozens of ongoing ministries. That gives people real, tangible reasons to stay connected to this institution beyond just who happens to be preaching that week. What makes the West Angeles story genuinely important to understand isn't just what it tells us about one church in Los Angeles. It's what it tells us about how large institutions, religious or otherwise, actually survive the loss of a founding leader. The organizations that make it are almost never the ones that relied entirely on one person's charisma. They're the ones that turn that charisma into systems, infrastructure, and trained successors, long before anyone was forced to say goodbye. Bishop Charles Blake spent 53 years doing exactly that, and whether or not you have any personal connection to this church or this denomination, that's a remarkable case study in leadership that's worth paying attention to. So here's the real question worth sitting with as we wrap up. In an era where so many institutions, churches, businesses, even entire industries struggle to survive the departure of the person who built them, West Angeles appears to be threading that needle. Not perfectly, not without challenges ahead, but with a level of intentional planning that most organizations never bother to put in place until it's already too late. If you found this breakdown interesting, let me know in the comments what you think the biggest test facing Pastor Charles Blake II will be over the next few years. And if you want more deep dives into the institutions and leaders shaping American religious and community life, make sure you're subscribed, because this is exactly the kind of story we'll keep digging into.